This isn't new. That's what brings me hope because it means that if it's not new, it's also not permanent.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On our introduction, we've got a special guest joining us today, Callie Chisholm, who's GFM's creative director, is going to join me to talk about the horrible shooting of Charlie Kirk in Utah this week. And then later on the pod, Missy and I sat down earlier to talk to Lloyd Barba, Sergio González, and Anita Huizar-Hernandez about the issue of immigration. It is a very thoughtful and solemn episode this week, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. We've got a very special guest with us joining us on our intro today. Missy is under the weather this week, so we have called up one of our incredible colleagues, Callie Chisholm. Callie is our creative coordinator for publishing and marketing here at Good Faith Media, and we thought it would be really insightful to have her on the pod because she is an incredible thinker, great processor, and we've already had some great conversations this week about what's going on in the news, in particularly what transpired in Utah this week with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But Callie, want to welcome you to Good Faith Weekly. Thank you so much for stepping in and taking Missy's place this week on this episode. I just can't thank you enough for being here with us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. It's really fun to be on this side of things. Usually I'm coming in after the fact, after you recorded. So I'm really excited to be on the pod today.
Yeah, for everybody listening, for anyone who sees us on social media, Callie is the genius behind all of our posts on social media. So yes, we're glad to have you on this side of the microphone this time. Well, Callie, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation today. But before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background because you've got a really unique background.
Yeah, sure. So currently I live in Knoxville. I've lived in a couple different places, grew up in Springfield, Missouri, practically lived there, my whole adolescence, all that good stuff. But I really got into journalism in high school and then continued that through college. And finally, I took on the chance to do an internship at Good Faith Media, and it led to this amazing job. And I've just been super happy ever since. But yeah, I grew up a pastor's kid, so I kind of have that unique perspective of understanding the Christianese kind of, understanding this world that
Sure.
we're in and trying to combine that with the passion that we have for social issues and things like that. So this job is kind of a great marriage of all of the things that I've been interested in.
Well, we couldn't be happier with your work here at Good Faith Media. And again, just want to thank you for joining us on this conversation. We thought it would be really interesting to have your thoughts on what has transpired this week with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You are in somewhat of his same generation, 20 to 30 years old. And so, I know that you and Charlie held different positions on a lot of the social issues that we talk about here at Good Faith Media, and Charlie addressed during his career. So let me ask you this question. What was your reaction when you heard the news that Kirk had been shot and killed this week in Utah?
Well, obviously, just very shocked by
Yeah,
it because he is such a prominent figure. I will say, because we kind of exist on total opposite ends of the political
right.
spectrum, I guess I was surprised also at just how beloved he was, I think,
Hmm.
on the right.
Hmm.
Obviously, he goes viral occasionally for saying something and it'll explode and it'll come up on my feed sometimes or people will react to it. But it really surprised me how much people believed in what he had to say, which I was also kind of eye-opening to me in some ways, but also just how gruesome his death was.
Hmm.
I didn't see the video. I was surprised that it was even online for as long as it
Right.
was, that was circulating on Twitter and TikTok, I heard. But the people that I talked to that did see the video were just blown away at how gruesome and bloody it was.
Mhm.
And I feel for all the people that had to see that in person.
Sure.
And just the trauma of hearing a gunshot go off or seeing someone die like that and then have to run for your life, not knowing if more shots are coming out. It's just so scary to think about being in that situation.
Yeah. And those are some excellent points because, you talked about Charlie's rhetoric during his life and career. And, he was a provocateur when he would talk and debate different people. But, what's been really interesting to me, and we've kind of done a deep dive into Charlie's background and his life. At the end of his life, unfortunately, you do this kind of research and you see photos of him and his wife, and you see his two little daughters. And all of a sudden, you begin to realize behind the rhetoric and political arguments that he would make, there is a person and there is a human being who has a wife and has two children. And it was interesting to me as I began that research, really seeing Charlie's humanity behind all of the rhetoric, behind all of the hateful speech that he has espoused in his career. And it was just a reminder that behind all of that, there is a human being. And that was really, eye-opening to me. And I know that sounds strange to even say that, but I think it's been a good reminder that we all have a human connection in this world, even when we are, diametrically opposed politically or religiously or geographically, that we are part of this symbiotic existence as human beings. And so I appreciate your thoughts on that. And then to go to the idea of trauma. And yes, the people who had to witness the assassination, who were there, and then anyone who saw it online. You know, Not only Kirk's death, as gruesome as it was, we have experienced this time and time again as a society, whether it is school shootings, whether it, is other political violence like we saw in Minnesota and New Mexico with Gabby Gifford. I am coming to the conclusion, Callie, that we as a country are living in trauma
Mhm.
of the violence that we experienced every day. Do you feel that?
I think in a way having access to all of this is a blessing and a curse, right? Because it's a blessing because we're able to be aware of the world around us. Information travels so much faster,
Hmm.
but at the same time it's like are our bodies built to withstand this much
Right.
suffering and trauma and anxiety and fear? Because that really does affect even something that happens on the other side of the country, the other side of the world, seeing it with our own eyes. Um, it's exhausting to have to see it over and over again, whether it's videos of police brutality or the suffering that's happening in Gaza or in
Hmm.
Ukraine or something that, or just even today is 9/11 when we're recording this, just seeing all the photos from 9/11 and the people that suffered that day. It's just like we're constantly being fed all of this stuff, and we just kind of have to decide for ourselves how much of it we can take without being ignorant of the issues.
Yeah. I remember the first time I was made aware of political violence, and I was in elementary school, which was a long time ago, Callie. We didn't even have air conditioning back at Walter Reed Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But I remember when Principal Cagle, which I can't believe I still remember his name, but Principal Cagle came on the intercom and told us that President Reagan had been shot. And I
Mm,
remember being fearful as a child and watching the news that night, talking to my parents about it. And, since then there is this continuous episodes of violence, and it's reoccurring throughout our country and has escalated to such a degree over the last couple of decades. Well, you are from a different generation than I am, and you have grown up with this violence all around you. I would imagine that you were just a toddler when 9/11 happened, which we memorialized this very week.
mhm.
So, as, a young professional, what what are your thoughts on the violence that you see and that you've had to endure all of your life?
I think for me, a lot of the frustration is when people aren't honest about the violence in this country. When a lot of times people say platitudes to try to feel better or
Right.
to provide comfort, like thoughts and prayers, or this isn't who we are, right? We hear that one a lot
Sure.
when stuff like this happens, when violence occurs. But that's kind of a lie, right? Like
Mhm.
even Sean Palmer today wrote a great article for us about this, just how violence is kind of baked into almost every aspect of our life here in this country, whether we like to hear that or not. It's true. Just thinking about like the natives people that were affected when the country was founded, and even
Sure.
the country's founding was just violent, right? Like Boston Tea Party and the Boston, like the massacres that happened and the war that happened.
Mhm.
And then you have the enslavement of people for hundreds of years, which followed with lynchings and Jim Crow and Sunday Bloody Sunday, like all of these things. So I don't think any generation has been exempt from experiencing this level of violence. I don't think any generation has had it easy, as people like to throw around a lot,
Right. Sure.
like, oh, we have it so easy. It's always been this violent. It's baked in. And so I think we have to start with being honest about that before we can do anything else, right? Because if we're not all on the same page, it's hard to find solutions.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of solutions, Callie, I mean, you know, I'm sitting here at 55 years old and just banging my head against the wall because it seems like in every tragedy, I eventually write an article about it. I talk about the history of violence and our propensity to embrace violence, even though we all like to talk about peace and paths forward. But the reality is, we are a violent people that live in a violent society. But if we are ever to get out of this hellhole that we are in, we've got to find a way forward. And I often talk about, people ask me as I travel across the country, what gives you hope? What gives you hope? Everybody wants to cling on to hope. And truly, the only hope I have these days is your generation, because I think you see the world differently and you have grown up in the midst of this chaos and confusion and violence, and you've had enough of it. So, my question to you is this: do you see a path out of this violent culture that we live in? And if so, please, Callie, give us some wisdom here.
Yeah, so I can't say that I have like the number one answer. Of course, it's every situation feels like it's got a different solution. And obviously I want to say I do am a staunch believer that we need more gun reform. So
Mhm.
first of all, I just want to say that
Sure.
because I saw a great post on Instagram. I think Everytown USA posted it on
Mhm.
Instagram that gun violence doesn't care about ideology,
Nope.
right? So it affects all of us, no matter who we are,
Mhm.
whether we're the CEO of United Healthcare or whether we're, someone on the street getting, shot or in a robbery or something. Like we all have this in common,
You're
right? This
absolutely
fear of
right.
getting shot.
Yeah.
We should not be walking around in fear of our lives, going to the grocery store, going to church, going to school, all these things. So we should, it is so hard for me not to understand how we can't all rally around this, right? But that's one thing that I want to say. Yeah. But other than that, I do think we also have to resist being super reactionary.
Yeah.
And I've had to practice this too.
Sure.
I've been guilty of this. Like even after Charlie's death,
Mhm.
we're starting to see all of this violent rhetoric popping up,
Yep.
hitting left and right against each other. Like, oh, this is because of the left. And people are saying, oh, no, this is because of the right. And so we don't even know who did it yet. I don't
Right.
think as we're recording, he's been caught. So
No.
we don't know who the perpetrator was.
Yeah.
But we're already seeing these narratives take shape
Yeah.
after this happened, people wanting to believe what they want to think happened and putting that narrative and sharing it. And so I think we need to resist being reactionary until we know all the information because I've been getting text about right-wing folks online talking
Mhm.
about, oh, this is war, right?
Right.
Or using violent language in response to a violent act.
Yeah.
I don't think is the right way to go. And of course, physical actions can be violent, but our words are also really violent. I think that's one thing that's so difficult about this for me is trying to show empathy to someone who would not have shown it back to me if it happened to me, right?
Mm.
like trying to show empathy towards someone who went on record saying that empathy isn't a real thing.
Right, right.
Saying terrible things about Black women, saying terrible things about immigrants, about women's roles, saying that the Civil Rights Act shouldn't have been passed,
Sure.
saying all these things about Martin Luther King, just a lot of these things that go against everything that I've ever stood for. And I think it's hard when someone like this dies that is so beloved to one set of folks, but is morally offensive.
Right.
To us. But I think that's the challenge of who we are as Christians, is to try to grapple with our own egos to show grace to someone who would not show it back to us if the roles were reversed. And I will, as my final thing, I will say, I don't know if you follow Black Liturgies by Cole Arthur Riley on Instagram. If you don't, you should. Everyone who's not following. Yeah, Cole Arthur Riley, she's amazing. She's an author, but she has this great Instagram page called Black Liturgies, and she posted Audre Lorde's famous quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And in the comments, she got a lot of backlash from that, because who was affected with Charlie Kirk, who was the total opposite of Audre Lorde, right?
Right.
And in the comments, she says, "I'm remaining close to these words by Audre Lorde today as I interrogate my own heart, reminding myself that our power doesn't look like theirs." And I just thought that was really powerful. So I just wanted to leave with that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. As you were talking, I recalled Dr. King's famous quote where he talks about hate is too great a burden to bear. And I think that's where we start. We have to all take a deep look in the mirror this week and say, what is driving me? What is fueling the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination? Is it hate? And because none of us should aspire to become what we despise. Again, we end where we began with this conversation, and that is we all have to realize we're part of this human existence. And each one of us are flesh and blood. We're all children of God. And yes, we can disagree. And even the fact that some of our enemies espouse the kind of language that Charlie espoused during his career, nonetheless, we are taught by Jesus himself to love our enemy. And as you eloquently put, sometimes that's difficult to do.
Right.
But that is a path forward. Is it achievable? It's going to be a long road, absolutely. But it's something I think we should all aspire to if we are going to get out of this hellhole of violence that we continue to experience each and every month in the United States of America. Callie Chisholm, thank you so much for joining us on our intro this week. It has been really insightful to get your thoughts on this matter and your wisdom. We all admire you here at Good Faith Media. We're so glad that you're on this side of the microphone this week instead of the opposite side. But check out Callie's work on all of our social media platforms. She does a great job, and she also puts together Good Faith Magazine each and every quarter, which is an incredible publication that she puts together. So check that out online at goodfaithmedia.org. Well, Callie, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be right back with Lloyd Barba, Sergio González, and Anita Huizar-Hernandez to talk about immigration.
Do you have a book idea, outline, or manuscript? Good Faith Media is always accepting book proposals. Our authors engage with an experienced team of editors, designers, and marketers to produce and sell books on a variety of topics. We publish in print and digital and help promote your work through the many resources of Good Faith Media. If you have a book proposal you'd like to run by us, head over to goodfaithmedia.org to get started. That's goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got three very special guests with us. Lloyd Barba is Assistant Professor of Religion and Core Faculty at Latinx and Latin American Studies at Amherst College. Sergio González is an Associate Professor of History at Marquette University. And joining them today is Anita Huizar-Hernandez, an Associate Director of the Hispanic Research Center and Professor at the School of International Letters and Cultures at Arizona State University. Lloyd, Sergio, Anita, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Excited to be here.
Well, we are excited to talk with you today. I mentioned before the interview started that we're really excited to talk to you, but the topic that we're here to discuss, lots going on in the country. For those of us who are very concerned with the issues centering on immigration and the mass deportation of these incredible people and families that we're seeing day in and day out, our hearts are breaking. So thank you for joining us and being part of this important conversation today. So since the last time we spoke, a lot of changes have occurred in the country. We're now living under the second Trump term, which has brought an escalation of deportations across the country, as I said a moment ago. Trump campaigned on deporting immigrants on a mass scale, and now he is implementing that promise. So here's my first question, and let's begin with Sergio and Lloyd, since you're our returning guest. Why do you think this message of anti-immigration is so appealing to a majority of the voters out there? Listeners, if you could see their reaction, it was kind of like the emoji hands up. We have no idea. But Lloyd, take a stab at it.
I'll say one brief point here is that the Trump administration has been successful in convincing a large portion, perhaps even the majority of the American population, that immigration, especially immigration from Latin America and the Caribbean, constitutes an invasion. And that's language that is quite obvious if you're to read the slew of executive orders that he signed in his very first day in office, right? He had to sort of set folks up for, I'm going to sign 100 executive orders my first day in office. And he accomplished basically that number. And about a tenth of them all pertained to immigration. And you can find these words of invasion that's really built into the language. And related to that is this idea of sanctuary. And at that point, I hand it over to Sergio, but that's definitely one of the major points here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that I would add, and we all work in historical studies in some capacity, and the thing we always have to note is that what Trump is tapping into is a long-running thread in American history, which is to say that if we like to celebrate our country's history as a nation of immigrants, we also have to acknowledge, of course, that we are a nation of nativism and xenophobia, and we can refer to different rupture points in American history where Americans have turned towards this very nasty, bigoted form of exclusionary politics that posits an entire population as the other. And that other, of course, is responsible for a slew of different things, economic, cultural, social issues. And so we're at a moment in our nation's history, unfortunately, that is another chapter in that long story. I think what I'm looking forward to talking about today is how that story is a lot more complicated when you get on the ground and start talking to people. That polling numbers tell us that, Americans are becoming more anti-immigrant, and one election will tell us that America is turning against immigration. And yet when you get on the ground and talk to people, it's a lot more complicated story.
Right. And Anita, you're part of this research and findings, and you, along with Sergio and Lloyd, have written a paper about a survey that has been recently released by PRI and a good friend of our pod, Robbie Jones. But in that paper, you all really point out some startling statistics. Now, more than half of the country believes in building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. 36% of Americans are believing now in the Great Replacement theory. 40% oppose granting legal residency to children brought into the country illegally. So, what do you take from all of this rising tide of anti-immigration?
Well, I am born and raised in Arizona. I've lived in the borderlands my whole life. Immigration has always been a big part of my personal and professional life.
Right.
And I think what we are interested in terms of our work is putting those numbers, which can seem really frightening and even surprising in context with more complex stories in the form of people's lives. So what we did as a team is we actually sat down and spoke to a group of 7 people who have been involved in doing immigrant rights activism from a faith-based perspective and thinking about how they came to those conclusions that are different than the numbers that you cited, and also what they see as the more cyclical nature of the way that immigration attitudes form. And actually, something that I found really surprising, a theme across what everyone said, is they were all relatively hopeful about the future. And maybe that's partially because of the faith-based nature of their work, but they said we've been here before.
Right.
And we're not entirely surprised that we're here again. And we're also not hopeless that we're going to remain here forever.
Well, let's pick up on that hope, Anita, because what we have been hearing here at Good Faith Media has been an evolving of attitude, a change in attitude since the election, even from people who voted for Trump, supported his mass deportation policies. And a lot of that, I think, stems from what we're seeing on the news and the stories that we're hearing across the country. All of a sudden, people are realizing it's one thing to vote for something like this. It's another thing to actually see it implemented. So are you seeing the same kind of evolving of attitudes across the country?
Yes, and I would say that's something that came out in the stories that each person shared with us, that none of these attitudes are set in stone. In fact, in their own lives, everyone expressed an evolving perspective in terms of how they approached their own work in the borderlands from a faith-based perspective. And I will say Sergio and Lloyd are historians. I'm a historian groupie, but my training is actually as a literary critic.
I am a historian groupie too, Anita, so it's nice to meet another.
No, it's hard not to be, especially right now. But as a literary critic, I have to say that I've always approached immigration and the border as a story.
Right.
And we can see that those stories are powerful, but they're also dynamic. And I think that's what's happening in this particular moment. The story that was being told during the election was a powerful story, a story that people found really compelling because of the situations that they found themselves in that were broader than immigration policy, something that we've seen many times, not just in the US, but throughout the world, in terms of the scapegoating of immigrants and just others in general. But here we are now, as the media is amplifying other kinds of stories, and people are maybe encountering other kinds of stories in their personal lives and their personal relationships and seeing, okay, this isn't actually what I thought I was signing up for, or I thought I wanted this, but now that I'm confronted with it, in fact, this isn't the kind of person I want to be. This isn't the kind of society I want to live in. This isn't the kind of community that I want to build.
Yeah. So Lloyd, let's continue along those lines. One of the components of contributing to this change in attitude across the country has been the tactics of ICE. We have seen them getting more and more aggressive with their tactics and their efforts to detain and deport. Historically, has this always been going on, or is this a ratcheting up before our eyes in the type of implementation of this policy? It seems very confrontational, but it also seems extremely violent. So tell us historically, is this something we've seen in the past, or is this something new?
I think one thing you can turn to is just looking at the budget that ICE now has,
Yeah,
that
there you
the
go.
Department of Security now has. So in some recent statistics I've seen, if you were to compare the budget now given compared to militaries across the world, we would be behind only China and the US in terms of the funding that's available now. So we're talking about the funding of a massive mobilization. And again, Trump ran on the promise, right, of implementing the biggest deportation in American history. So a few things I mean, a lot of things are concerning, but a couple of things I can point folks to is one, we've seen propaganda coming from social media pages from the White House directly in ways we've not seen social media instrumentalized. So, I mean, I imagine some of the listeners to Good Faith Media might have already seen when the White House and DHS and other social media pages, there was an advertisement for ICE recruitment.
Right.
And the scripture right? That was integrated into this recruitment tool was, "Here I am, Lord, send me," drawing from the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah responds to the Lord to be sent out. Now they're using that kind of biblical rhetoric, and I think seeing that, if not new, it is far more intensified than we've seen in other periods.
Hmm.
Um, and that has a lot to do with the Christian nationalist base that is supporting Trump, and they're putting this messaging that's out there. So it is politically much more violent. I think the religious rhetoric is much more violent. And again, now with the funding, I think we have yet to see the violence of the dragnet, right? Of just
Right.
taking folks. The language out there is, we're taking the hard and violent criminals, but we know that's not even a statistically relevant number. That's exactly why, again, the White House X page, Facebook page, and Instagram pages, they post pictures of, "We caught so and so, and they have been accused of, XYZ crimes." They only have a couple of those because they need to amplify the message that we're delivering on Trump's promise. But that, again, that runs contrary to any actual hard statistics that we have.
Right. So, fortunately and unfortunately, these tactics are beginning to sway public opinion because we are seeing more and more people speak out against the tactics of ICE. So, Sergio, let's turn to another component that's contributing to this change in attitude, and that's just the stories themselves that Anita mentioned a moment ago. I mean, all of a sudden, people are waking up to the fact that, hey, these aren't hardened criminals. This is my kid's soccer coach. This is someone I work with, at the job site. This is someone who I love and adore. This is a family member who are being detained and deported. These are parents of Marines, as we've seen on television. So tell us a little bit about that personalization of these stories and why it's so important in this conversation.
Yeah, when we last spoke, Lloyd and I mentioned kind of the dynamics that were playing out during the presidential campaign of 2024. And we might remember during the Republican National Convention on the floor, people were handed out these signs that were calling for mass deportations. I mean, this was kind of a singular call of the Republican platform and of Trump's presidency as he was kind of approaching this second term. And so in some ways, we might think about this being an unequivocal plank of the original platform. And so it might be confusing because there was never really any hiding of what was coming, right? When he was calling for a mass deportation force, there really wasn't any sort of equivocation on who was going to be caught up in that. But now the reality, of course, as you mentioned, Mitch, is that this is hitting all parts of the country. I mean, I live here in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has not witnessed the types of deportation rates that we've seen in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and New York or Chicago. But a recent ACLU report listed that our deportation numbers have doubled in the last year, right? Doubled in Wisconsin. And what does that mean? Well, how does that play out in a place not like Milwaukee, where I am, which is our largest city, but in a place like Abbotsford, which is in central Wisconsin, right? A place where the towns would have completely collapsed had it not been for the arrival of Latino immigrants over the last decade. We're talking about places where students make up 60 to 70% of the kindergarten classrooms, right? I mean, this is complete transformations of parts of our country. And now we see individuals who are afraid. They see what's happening on the news in Los Angeles. They know that, as Lloyd mentioned, there is a massive infusion of dollars coming into these deportation forces. Congress passed this summer the reconciliation bill that included $150 billion for additional immigration and border enforcement. And that kicks in on October 1st, which means what we've seen to date is just the remnants of previous Democratic and Republican administrations that have created this deportation force. What's coming is going to be even worse. And so I think if people have begun to be swayed against what they voted for in the 2024 election, I would imagine it's going to get even worse, but there's not an inevitable force to that, right? We have to continue to do this work of public education, of talking to people and to reminding them that when you're calling for a mass deportation force, this dragnet is going to pull up everyone.
Absolutely. Okay, so Anita, I'm going to save our most difficult question for our newbie to the pod this time. But you have mentioned faith several times in your remark. And so here's a very blunt question. How in the hell can Christians support these kind of policies? Because when I read the scriptures, it is filled with the importance of the theology of hospitality. And Jesus himself spoke time and time again about the importance of welcoming the stranger. And Jesus himself was an immigrant at an early age. So What can you make of all of this support from the Christian community when it comes to anti-immigration policies?
I think it is, on the one hand, difficult to understand. I think Jesus is a very border crossing figure in many different ways across many different realms. And so it's difficult on the one hand to imagine how a religious tradition that is rooted in celebrating border
Hmm.
crossing and meeting people across borders could have taken this turn. And yet, at the same time, we see throughout human history, all religious traditions, or nearly all religious traditions, especially once they're allied with power,
Sure.
are happy to do what I suppose as a literary critic I would call creative close readings, where you pick and choose very specific parts, like the verse that Lloyd just mentioned, and certainly derived of context, you can find the right kinds of messages to fit within your own worldview. And I think it's a matter of priority, right? Are you
Hmm.
trying to, in that idea of Christian nationalism, which one is
Right.
the stronger pull for you?
Yeah.
Is it the nationalism, in which case Christianity is going to be subservient to that and you're going to make it fit
Right.
into a nationalist structure? Or is it Christianity, in which the nation, whether it's the US or any other kind of nation, is going to be a less powerful force? And you
Sure.
really can't have it both ways. And
Yeah.
I think that's what we're seeing right now with this particular tension between those two poles.
So you think Christian nationalism has basically supplanted kind of traditional Christian values of taking care of the immigrant, taking care of the stranger?
And I'm hopeful, like the people that we spoke with, that that internal contradiction is
Hmm.
something that is so destabilizing that it can't remain that way forever, at
Hmm.
least not in such a pervasive way.
Yeah.
And I suppose that depends on your listeners' individual sort of faith traditions as well, and
Sure.
what they believe and who they think is in charge of
Mhm.
various things. But certainly that kind of very intense contradiction can only hold for so long until it breaks apart. And the real question is going to be, what's going to be the result
Right.
of that break? And to Sergio's point, I think that's why those of us who don't agree with some of the things that we're seeing right now really need to be active, because
Mhm.
we know that some sort of break is coming, or arguably is already here. And it's not set in stone what's going to happen as
Yeah.
a result of that break.
So Sergio and Lloyd, it seems like, as Anita is describing kind of what you all discovered in the research, is that there is a disconnect because there's a lot of people of faith that still believe in compassion and kindness and generosity. But when it comes to immigration, it seems like they don't apply those principles that they believe in and practice to this particular policy. So is that fair to say? And, is there any kind of explanation for that disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I've been doing a lot of research, Mitch. My next project here is thinking about the blowback against Christian empathy and hospitality in regards to migrant ministry. And while I'm very worried about Christian nationalism, I'm less concerned with the flashier aspects of it that we might think of like January 6th.
Hmm.
I'm concerned with what's happening on the fringes that are leading into kind of the mainstream. So I think about your Vice President J.D. Vance, convert to Catholicism, and there's no zealots like converts to the faith. And I think about his very weak theological reading of this idea of order amoris, right? This idea that there has to be an order to the type of love that we have as Christians. And there's kind of analogs to that. Allie Beth Stuckey has this idea of toxic empathy, right? Accusing liberal Christians of having a form of empathy that actually degrades our faith, right? And this is all kind of a ramification of white Christian nationalism, but we kind of consume it in a different way. And what it does is it tries to tell us that our conceptions of faith as being those that are centered in love and hospitality and empathy are wrong and dangerous, and that they're destructive to our concepts of our family and to community and to the very nation. And that to me is really dangerous things that we need to call out. And so it's our job as academics, as people of faith, as members of our congregations, to question these things and to think, why are we reconceptualizing the very kind of base ethics of our faith, which tell us to love our neighbor and to welcome the stranger and to treat the least of these as if they were our own brothers and sisters?
Yeah. And Lloyd?
Question, the debate, the topic of immigration has always fascinated me as it pertains to sort of these polarized spectrum in Christianity. So you have folks who, quote unquote, Bible believing Christians, right? That tends to often center a bit more of an evangelical kind of conservative identity. All that, but except when it comes to these things of immigration. So what do? You replace it with these ideas like toxic empathy, for example, right? You draw up some sort of theology to sort of supplant these rather very obvious biblical ideas. And one of my favorite ways of thinking about this, especially again, I'm always inclined to pull things back to sanctuary, right? But one thing that was
Right.
very obvious to me during the sanctuary movement of the 80s and even in the new sanctuary movement now is when it comes to the topic of immigration, it's one of those cases where, you know, perhaps surprisingly to some folks, it is your mainline progressive Christians who have a lot more Bible proof texting, if you will, for their cause,
Ah,
as opposed to the conservative counterparts who will hit you over the head with the Bible, right? And say, we're a Bible-believing Christian, and it plainly says in scripture right here.
mhm.
Well, I mean, you can turn to tons of scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, that clearly show how to treat the foreigner, the stranger, and to not oppress them. One of my favorite quotes came from one of our interviewees for this report that we wrote up for the Public Religion Research Institute. She referred to herself as a Jesus person. She said, Jesus would welcome the stranger, Jesus would feed the hungry, Jesus would heal the sick. Jesus would do all these things. Jesus accepted everyone. So that's the kind of way I'd like to be. And this gives me
I
a
love
framework
that.
to do that. So again, when you really do take the words of Jesus seriously, I think it's really hard to gainsay the saliency, right, of treating the stranger, the other, the foreigner with not just compassion, but as we would want to be treated ourselves.
Yeah, I love that fact. And the fact that you brought us back to the sanctuary movement, and that leads me into my next question, is that, when we talked, obviously you conducted a podcast, which is absolutely excellent on the history of the sanctuary movement. But we talked about the sanctuary movement never went away, that it continues to exist even today. I am assuming that the sanctuary movement is not only alive and well today, but expanding across the country because of what we're experiencing. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with the sanctuary movement now?
I think the part that we're grappling with as scholars, as practitioners, as people who have spent time with sanctuary activists, is the way in which sanctuary has been forced to mutate under
Right.
our current political circumstances. The sanctuary movement in the 1980s and in the early 2000s was always dependent on what we could consider kind of a game of chicken with the state, which is to say that it was basically forcing the state to cross that religious threshold, that sacred space into churches. And for much of the last 40, 50 years, there was an acknowledgement that the state would not violate that space. I think under the second Trump administration, however, no one is working under the pretenses that ICE agents will not enter those spaces, right? One of the first things that President Trump did in January of this year was to revoke the sensitive locations memo, which functionally barred immigration agents from entering houses of worship, schools, and hospitals. And so in response to that, people of faith who are deeply engaged in migrant ministry and in immigration advocacy have been forced to change their tactics. To this date, we can't really talk about public sanctuary. It's not really happening in the United States. Most people have been forced to engage in what we would call private sanctuary, and it's not something that's going to be heavily publicized
Right.
because there's that fear, of course, of the
Sure.
target being on the back of houses of worship and people of faith who are doing this migrant ministry work.
Mhm.
Just to add to that, some of the folks that we talked to also talked about what I suppose we could call the externalization of the sanctuary movement beyond the borders of the United States. And so thinking about if the purpose of the sanctuary movement is to create a safe space for people to exist and to plan their next steps in a way that is not rushed and in a way where they have the support network that is necessary for them to determine where best and how best to continue their lives. That is now happening in other countries beyond the United States. And so we're seeing a more transnational
Mhm.
kind of structure, which has always existed. It's not unique to this moment, but a lot of these organizations that we think about along the US-Mexico border and even in other parts of the United States are now heavily focusing on the arms of their ministry that exist beyond the borders of the United States for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Okay, so before I turn it over to Missy to ask our final question for during our time together, I've got one last question myself, and that is there's a lot of darkness in the country right now surrounding this particular issue. We've already talked about a lot of that darkness, but in visiting with the three of you, reading your research and reading your papers, there are some things to be hopeful for. So, Anita, I want to begin with you. In 60 seconds, what is bringing you hope today?
This isn't new.
Mm.
That's what brings me hope, because it means that if it's not new, it's also not permanent.
Oh, I love that. That's a great statement. So, Lloyd, what brings you hope today?
I draw hope from the conversations that we had with the faith workers there at ground zero at the border, some again on the Mexico side and some on the US side, some working across the border. And we titled our spotlight for the Public Religion Research Institute, "The Border Informs My Faith." And one of the things that we found in speaking to these seven faith workers at the border was they are transformed by their work at the border. So even if they have these preconceptions about what immigration looks like, the maybe harm that is causing to the country, when you're there firsthand, it does have the potential to change you. And I take hope from folks doing this good work in the border. But again, it's not just there, right? This is going to, given what Sergio said about, what's to come still, this is going to be a battle that's going to be fought on all fronts.
Yeah.
But I do take hope from this idea of relentless hope that we do continue doing God's work, even when conditions are not necessarily favorable to it.
Yeah. And Lloyd, since you mentioned the report, where can our audience find the report?
Yeah, so we'll be sure to provide a link, but it will be in the Public Religion Research Institute's website. It's in a series called the Spotlight Reports. And so again, we'll be sure to link that as soon as it's posted.
Okay. And Sergio, what's bringing you hope?
As a historian, as a teacher, what gives me hope in doing these oral histories and talking with people of faith who are engaged in this work is that the best students of history are the people who are doing the work on the ground. We learn so much in talking with these individuals in so many different ways, but most importantly, we learned that they were the best students of history, and they were already engaged with the history of the sanctuary movement, the history of migrant ministry, the history of the U.S.-Mexico border. And so what gives me hope is that they are more than willing to share their stories as a form of consciousness raising, of a form of education. We might even say as a form of conversion experiences for the rest of us, so that we can come to know the faith as they do, as one that is engaging and empathetic and welcoming to everyone.
Well, if I were to have to answer this question myself, I would say, what gives me hope? I would say Sergio, Lloyd, and Anita. You three are giving me hope because you're doing the research and you're providing incredible, important information to the public that is invaluable. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. You are bringing hope to all of us who are fighting this battle. Well, before we let the three of you go, we've got one last question for you, and Missy has the honor of asking it, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
So as you all know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell? Anita, we will begin with you.
I would encourage your listeners to check out the incredible work done by the various organizations that each of these folks that we spoke with works with. That's the Casa de la Misericordia, the Kino Border Initiative, Frontera de Cristo, the Phoenix Legal Action Network, the Tucson Samaritans, the former migrant shelter Casa Alitas, but it's good to have that historical perspective, as well as various ecumenical councils that are operating in the borderlands that are supporting these different spaces.
Love all those organizations.
All right, Lloyd, how about you? What's your more to tell?
The more to tell is read the report when it's out. I mean, we have things hyperlinked, right? We have the Public Religion Research Institute statistics. They're startling. So I encourage folks to regard the statistics, but also get a good sense of what folks on the ground are thinking and doing.
Yeah, what an important point. Stay informed, people. Stay informed.
All right, Sergio, how about you? What's your more to
I'm going
tell?
to plug, I'm going to do this, Lloyd. I'm going to plug a book that Lloyd and I have coming out pretty soon with the New York University Press. It's an edited volume on the history of the sanctuary movement. And I want to plug that to say that everything that Anita, Lloyd, and I have talked about today is just really scratching the surface of a longer history that I think can serve us really well. And to remember that even though we feel like we're living in unprecedented times, we have the tools to be creative and to think about alternative futures for ourselves and for our communities.
Well, Sergio, Lloyd, Anita, thank you so much for joining us this week on Good Faith Weekly. Again, we're sorry that we have to talk about such a complicated and troubling situation in our country. But as I said, the three of you are giving us hope. Thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And to our audience, we want to thank you for joining us again this week on Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I will be back next week with another incredible guest. Until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.